Yeah, it's a great question, and I really want to be able to preface that by acknowledging all my teachers and the people who really made me who I am today, and some of them may be watching the show today. And thanks so much for all your leadership and your guidance and wisdom. But a little bit about myself is I was born in Edmonton, Alberta, here where I'm at on Treaty 6 territory and land that's special and insignificant to the Métis people. However, it's not where I was raised. So my story actually begins not at that point, but before then. And for many Indigenous people, it's very similar. Our stories are just intertwined with this legacy in Canada, with this history, this legal and political history that defines who we are, says where we are, says where we're allowed to be born, tells us when we can be born, tells us that there are certain points when or where we should live. And so our lives, I think, have a special kind of arc to them as Indigenous people because there's always been this force to push us and guide us as Indigenous people to the particular destination that others want for us, not ourselves. But I was part of a story of how we got to break that kind of cycle. And so, of course, you're well aware, Sean, of the terribly atrocious things that Canada has done in its short 150 years, not or including but not excluding any many stories, but some of the big ones, of course, that we hold so common in our nations is the history of residential school, the
Hmm.
history of 60 Scoop, and the history of the ongoing stealing of our children through the children welfare system, the child and family services system. So I found my way as a young person, born right into the conflict that was the intergenerational 60s Scoop. And so my birth mother, her name was Brenda, and she lived her entire life in Edmonton, other than when she was a child, of course. She lived in the bush just like many of us did at that point. And the RCMP and the Alberta Social Services came in and said unfit parents, so common across the communities. And the point they get to what is an unfit parent, just for some folks who may not know some of the how fast someone can come to that conclusion is these reserves and Métis settlements where I'm from a Métis settlement, extremely underfunded, only public housing, shortage of housing, no clean water, lots of issues. And so when you come into that setting, it's really easy to say that child has no clean water because there's no infrastructure for it. There's been no
Hmm.
plans for it. And so it's easy to abduct my mother. They had so many excuses to point to. Um, she was taken and unfortunately lived a terribly traumatic life, being separated from her siblings, being separated from her parents from a very young age, for to the time she aged out. And for those listeners who may not know, what we say is aging out is when someone from the child and family services or foster homes, when they enter the system and they reach the maximum age allowable for state protection under that system, they have to exit it. And so she aged out. She was in the system for that entire time until she aged out. And all too commonly, especially as an Indigenous woman, she went onto the streets. And these are communities that are often totally, we totally neglect in so many ways. Their social economic status, all the way to things like even their basic presence and survival. And so she lived that life and survived that hard life through, she was a sex worker. She through that had to cope with drugs, cope with her trauma with drugs, and it developed into an addiction. But she was a survivor, and like so many of our people were survivors, and she survived those tough streets and was able to give birth to me. I was sent to the University of Alberta Hospital in an ambulance. She was found, and she was underwent an emergency C-section to save my life as a very small baby. And from that moment on, it was a race against the time, race against the RCMP. Who was going to get to me first as a baby? Was it going to be the RCMP or was it going to be a family member? And so, luckily enough, Brenda had the strength to call the mother who raised me, her sister. Her name was Grace from the nearby Métis settlement in Fishing Lake. Was the oldest sister. So she phoned her and said, Grace, you got to get over here. You know, I'm having this baby and it's happening now. And she spent the last little dollar she had on a bus ticket that got her out of the bush all the way to Edmonton, where she met me at the University Hospital. I'm so grateful for that she took that bus trip and she even answered the phone. Like it's so many miracles happened. But she got there, and thankfully enough, she was met by one of the very few and rare social workers that said, you know, you don't look like someone who would be a drug addict. You don't look like someone who this kid can't go home with, Grace. what she told her. And I think we can have a real serious fight for this one. The doctors and nurses, many folks said, you're never going to happen. This woman came right off the street. This baby's going to be taken. Um, they told my mom this list of things that the court would need, and she went through them. She checked every single one of them. The terrible bureaucratic process that is this wall for Indigenous people to get past, she got past. And the judge, months later, granted custody to the mother who raised me, Grace, after a legal battle with the state. But that just goes to show a little bit about where I'm from, what the values I have, and just my deep sense of reciprocity, which guides me today and is largely the reason I want to serve the people of Edmonton-Greisbach, the people on 118th Avenue, the people like my birth mom who suffered that life, to give them that dignity back, to say, look, we survived. We got out of it, and we're still here.